Hello and welcome to this special broadcast from WION. My name is Mohammed Saleh. Now, Donald Trump is on the cusp of making what could effectively be the most defining moment of his presidency. After having denounced America's forever wars abroad, the self-proclaimed American president of peace, who never tires of claiming credit of having stopped more than 8 wars around the world, could potentially spark off what could be described as the mother of all wars in the Middle East. Now, to this end, Donald Trump has mobilized a massive naval armada, but not everyone seems convinced. And General Caine, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has raised some concerns about the risks involved if the US military were to carry out the strikes in Iran. Now, there are reports that Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and Steve Witkoff, who interestingly happens to be a real estate developer, have been weighing in on the question: should Donald Trump pull the trigger on Iran? Now, to put things in perspective, we're joined in this broadcast by retired Colonel David Roche, who is currently a professor at Thayer Marshall Institute and a former deputy director for peacekeeping in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Colonel Roche, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on WION, sir.
Thank you.
All right, now, there's a lot that's being said in terms of the naval armada the Americans have put in place. But someone like, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Caine, where there are now reports which state that he is perhaps not entirely convinced about the risks that are involved, where he's said to have, raised this issue with Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, of course, put out that post on Truth Social, where he has said that all of these reports are just fake news. And even General Caine is convinced that this is a war that can be won easily. What do you think this entire controversy about?
Well, I think there's two things. So the first thing is the chairman has to give his unalloyed military advice to the president. He is the president's primary military advisor, and it is his duty not just to say this is a plan, this is what you want, but also to say this is what could go wrong. So the chairman's advice, and all military advice, is usually more hesitant than what you would hear from political figures like the Secretary of Defense. So that's the first thing. The second thing is what we seem to have in place is the framework for an initial strike that will deal with the things that the United States is concerned about, which is the missile production, the nuclear program, and the Revolutionary Guard leadership who massacred the protesters in January. But most of the bulk of the military infrastructure in place seems to be to deter Iran from striking out against the civilian capacity of the GCC and Azerbaijan after that American strike. Well, deterrence is fundamentally a political concept. It's really a psychological concept. You don't get to decide when your opponent is deterred. Your opponent gets to decide that. And I think that Caine is raising that point, which is, if we strike these Iranian targets, they may not be impressed by the threat of greater destruction to, say, for example, their oil industry, their electrical grid. They may just continue to fight and be willing to see their infrastructure destroyed just for the sake of making a point. And I think that that's the kind of advice that's going out there. But given the nature of the people who surround President Trump, I think any raising of any sort of hesitation with what they think Trump wants is probably seen as dissent or even disloyalty.
That's an interesting and an important point that you've made. But Colonel Roche, I want you to weigh in, on the objectives of the negotiation that the Americans are even having with the Iranians. Now, the objectives for the negotiations appear to be that the Americans want to talk about the Iranian nuclear program, Iran's ballistic missiles, and also about the resistance groups that the Iranians back in the Middle East. But there is a lot of talk that the actual objective of this massive military mobilization is to spark a war to, in many ways, bring about a regime change in Iran. And that is the objective, which is very, very hard to achieve. In your assessment, do you think the American president has got it clear in his mind as to what the objective is if a war were to break out with Iran?
Yeah, that's a good question. So first off, I don't think the president wants to have a war with Iran. He wants to have a limited strike, and then he wants that to be the end of it. I think the president's theory of victory, all American presidents since the revolution have recognized that the regime is inherently expansionist. The Iranian Constitution calls for wars of conquest. You know, that's they say that. So.
But they haven't done anything of that nature. You know, since 1979, that Iran has been in existence, the Ayatollahs have been the supreme leaders there. The Iranians have not expanded, nor have they started a war of expansion anywhere that we can think of. So how do you back up what you just said?
No. The Iranians, you know, the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament at one point said we control 4 Arab capitals: Beirut, Damascus, Sana'a, and Baghdad. And they did airlift thousands, tens of thousands of forces into Syria in support of Bashar al-Assad, to include mercenaries from other countries. But setting that aside, the American aims about missiles, proxy forces, and the nuclear program are constant. I think the reason why we're having this argument right now is because of the protests, which were spontaneous, which caught Trump and everybody else and the Iranians by surprise. And President Trump said that he would support the protesters. And then he turned to his military and discovered that this was probably the first time in 25 years we didn't have an aircraft carrier in the region.
Right.
But Trump's theory of victory is not a militarily imposed regime change. That's George W. Bush. That's what he ran against. He thinks economic pressure will do it. So Trump views this as a momentary flare-up, as something that you know, is putting Iran in their box and trying to set new rules. But ultimately, regime change has to come from within.
That's an interesting point that you make. And also there are now reports that have emerged that the likes of Jared Kushner, who is Donald Trump's son-in-law, and also Steve Witkoff, who is another trusted aide of Donald Trump, who's been negotiating with the Russians and who's also been instrumental in bringing about the ceasefire on the Gaza Strip. They apparently are weighing in on whether Donald Trump should in fact order a strike on Iran. Now, these two gentlemen could be pretty smart and intelligent, but they're not military specialists. The fact that these two individuals are businessmen and real estate developers, how concerned are you that they are advising the American president, the leader of arguably the strongest military force in the world, on whether he should go to a war with Iran or not?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I'm not sure what kind of advice he's providing, whether they're just being a sounding board, but this is not unusual. You know, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, John F. Kennedy's primary advisor was his brother, who was the Attorney General, didn't really have a security function, and who he was criticized as appointing Attorney General because he was so young and inexperienced. So presidents get to choose who they want to advise them, and, you know, but they ignore the military advice at their peril. And I think that it's actually a good sign that the president's seeking a wide range of people. And these two, Kushner and Witkoff, who are relative neophytes to international diplomacy, they have been talking to folks in the region. I think that they are probably more likely to be voices for restraint than voices for moving over, because they have been in the case of Kushner, raising money in the Gulf in the last 4 years. So they know what Gulf concerns are about, you know, just irritating Iran and then walking away, or leading to a failed state in Iran, both of which concern our Gulf partners.
All right, my final question to you is something that is being spoken about a lot with respect to America's military preparedness. Gerald R. Ford is the biggest aircraft carrier that the Americans have, arguably the most advanced ones. But the reports that are coming out that Gerald R. Ford is having some serious sewage plumbing crises, where it's pretty hard to even, you know, go to the toilet on what is arguably the most advanced aircraft carrier in the world. How prepared do you think the American forces really are? And what does this kind of a crisis even say about America's military hardware and its preparedness?
Yeah, so the Ford is the most modern carrier in the American fleet, and it had two big challenges. They tried new things. Two of them were an issue. The first was a electronic catapult for launching planes instead of the steam catapult, which allows for a decrease in manpower, but that took a long time. And then the second was the sewage system. There are two things about this. The first one is it's not just a gravity run thing, because the ship pitches, it has to turn. So it has a vacuum seal. It's like a pneumatic tube. And so multiple toilets are controlled by one vacuum valve. If that valve goes down, then the toilets, a group of toilets, don't function. I think they adopted a cruise ship model that doesn't have to turn that way, and it just doesn't work on the ship. So that's going to be a major rethink. The second issue, which a lot of conservatives are angry with, is that they didn't build urinals in this ship. They did toilets because they said, well, we're a gender-integrated Navy now. And I think in retrospect, it may make sense to have urinals just because the engineering challenge, the volume of sewage you have to deal with coming from toilets are easier to manage if you have some urinals and some toilets. These are irritants.
Right.
If you talk to people who have sailed on Navy ships, they'll talk about problems with toilets. Apparently, it's a long-running thing. Navy doesn't like to talk about it because it's not good for recruiting. But
but the images that are coming out from Gerald R. Ford, it'll put off a lot of these sailors if they want to prospectively join the American Navy.
Absolutely. But the Ford has been at sea under near combat or combat conditions since June. So it's clearly not impeding it. The Ford was the flagship of the fleet for the Venezuela operations, and it has been at sea since June. So it clearly can function and accomplish its mission. But this is an irritant, and it is kind of embarrassing, and it's kind of a little chuckly thing. It's an embarrassment for the Navy. The Navy has forgotten how our Navy has not really been promoting shipbuilders for quite some time, and there's a number of reasons for that. But we had a feckless Undersecretary of the Navy at the end of the Obama administration who spent most of her time parachuting with SEALs rather than focusing on shipbuilding.
All right, I think you've touched upon a number of important issues there. Thank you very much indeed, Colonel David de Roche, for joining us with that perspective.
Thank you.